The chainsaw's roar cut through morning stillness as Deputy Marcus Holbrook approached the weathered farmhouse, his boots crunching over autumn leaves that smelled of wood smoke and decay. In Pocahontas County, West Virginia, where families had worked the same mountain ridges for generations, people didn't just disappear, especially not entire bloodlines in a single night. But on October 15th, 1978, the Kellerman family had done exactly that, leaving behind only cold coffee and unanswered questions that would haunt these hollers for decades. Before we trace their final hours, I want to know where you're watching from right now and what time it is where you are. Drop a comment below. And if mysteries that refuse to stay buried fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happened to the Kellermans challenges everything we think we know about how people simply vanish. The call had come in at 7:32 a.m. from neighbor Eliza Boggs, whose voice cracked through the static of the county radio dispatcher. The Kellermans had missed Sunday service at Marlinton Methodist for the first time in 37 years. When Harold Kellerman failed to appear for his weekly chess game with Pastor Williams, folks started asking questions. In these mountains, routine was sacred. Deviation meant trouble. Deputy Holbrook had known Harold since childhood, a 63-year-old retired coal supervisor who'd raised 5 children after his wife Margaret died in a logging accident in 1961. Harold's oldest son, Thomas, 38, had returned from Vietnam with shrapnel in his leg and secrets behind his eyes. He'd been living at the family homestead with his wife, Susan, and their twin daughters, 8-year-old Amy and Sarah. The youngest Kellerman, Michael, 24, worked construction in Charleston, but visited every weekend without fail. 7 people. 3 generations. Gone. The farmhouse sat like a monument to abandonment at the end of a gravel road that wound through pine stands older than the Civil War. Holbrook's breath misted in the October chill as he climbed the sagging porch steps, noting the swing still moved in the breeze, chains creaking their familiar song. The front door stood unlocked, as was custom in Pocahontas County, where folks still believed in the goodness of neighbors. Inside, the scene suggested normalcy fractured mid-motion. Sunday dinner remained on the table, roast chicken carved but barely touched, green beans congealing in their serving bowl, biscuits hard as stones. 6 plates set with military precision, Harold's habit from his army days. Coffee cups half empty, cream still forming skin on the surface. The grandfather clock in the corner had stopped at 11:47 p.m., its pendulum hanging motionless like a held breath. What struck Holbrook most was the absence of struggle. No overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no signs of forced entry. The scene resembled a stage-set moments after actors had simply walked off, leaving their performance frozen in time. In Harold's study, his reading glasses lay folded atop yesterday's Charleston Gazette, open to the obituaries, a habit he'd developed since Margaret's death, searching for familiar names among the departed. Upstairs, beds remained unmade from the previous night. The twins' room showed evidence of childhood interrupted. Coloring books abandoned mid-page, crayons scattered across homework assignments due Monday morning. In the master bedroom Thomas and Susan shared, their wedding photo smiled from the nightstand, capturing a happiness that predated war and mountain isolation. Mountains keep their secrets. The methodical search revealed personal items left behind. Harold's wallet containing $87 and his veteran's identification, Susan's purse with car keys and grocery list, Thomas's Purple Heart displayed on his dresser. Nobody packed bags. Nobody wrote notes. The family vehicles, a 1975 Ford pickup and a rusty Oldsmobile sedan, sat in the driveway with full gas tanks and clean ashtrays. Whatever had summoned the Kellermans from their dinner table had been urgent enough to abandon everything, yet gentle enough to leave no trace of violence. By afternoon, Sheriff Dale Morrison had called in the state police. Detective Ray Cummins, a 20-year veteran of missing persons cases, arrived from Charleston with a team of investigators who spread through the property like forensic ants. They dusted for fingerprints, photographed every angle, collected samples of the abandoned food. The meal tested clean. No poison, no drugs, nothing to explain the family's sudden exodus. Neighbors gathered at the property line, speaking in hushed tones about strange lights some claimed to have seen in the hills the previous night. Old-timer Jesse Rawlings mentioned unusual sounds around midnight. Not screaming or violence, but something he described as singing that wasn't quite singing. When pressed for details, he shook his head and wandered back to his cabin, muttering about things better left undisturbed. The investigation's first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The Kellerman's dog, a loyal blue-tick hound named Scout, who'd been found 3 miles away at sunrise, whimpering outside the abandoned Seneca mine shaft. The animal showed no signs of injury, but trembled uncontrollably when brought back to the farmhouse, refusing to enter the building where he'd lived for 6 years. What had Scout witnessed that night that his canine mind couldn't process? As darkness fell on that first day, Detective Cummins stood on the Kellerman porch, studying the mountains that surrounded the property like sleeping giants. Somewhere in those ancient ridges lay the answer to how 7 people could vanish more completely than if the earth had opened and swallowed them whole. But the mountains weren't talking. They never did. And in the shadows, Cummins couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him back, something that had been waiting patiently in these hills long before the Kellermans arrived, and would remain long after their mystery was forgotten. The first night search would reveal tracks leading into the forest, but what followed those tracks would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about the nature of disappearance itself. Flashlight beams carved pale tunnels through the October night as the search team followed footprints that led from the Kellerman farmhouse into the Monongahela National Forest. The tracks, pressed deep into rain-softened earth, told a story that made seasoned investigators pause. 7 sets of bare feet moving in perfect single file, as if the family had sleepwalked into the wilderness wearing only their Sunday clothes. This wasn't a panicked flight or a kidnapping. The spacing and depth suggested people walking calmly, deliberately, toward something that awaited them in the ancient woods. Detective Cummins crouched beside the clearest impression, a child's footprint no bigger than his palm. Amy or Sarah Kellerman had stepped here 12 hours ago, her small foot sinking into mud that still held the outline of her toes. The print faced north, toward the old logging trails that wound deeper into mountain terrain where cell towers couldn't reach, and compasses spun uselessly near iron deposits buried in the earth. Volunteer searcher Bobby Hensley, a local hunting guide who'd tracked wounded deer through these same hollows for 20 years, shook his head at what he observed. "Never seen anything like it," he muttered, his breath misting in the 40-degree air. 7 people walking barefoot over rocks and briars, and not one drop of blood. Not one stumble or deviation from the line. The trail stretched for 2 miles before vanishing completely at Spruce Creek, where the water ran black under starlight and reflected nothing. The search dogs, German shepherds brought from the state police kennel, stopped at the creek's edge and refused to continue, whimpering and backing away from water that had flowed through these mountains since before European settlers arrived. Their handlers had never seen trained tracking animals react with such obvious fear. From the search log, October 16th, 1978. Dogs exhibit extreme distress at creek crossing, refusal to enter water or proceed. Veterinary examination shows no physical cause for behavior. Local folklore spoke of Spruce Creek in whispers passed down through Cherokee and pioneer families alike. The water was said to flow backward during certain moon phases, carrying voices of the lost back downstream. Old maps mark the area with cryptic notations, Singing Waters and Devil's Throat. But Cummins was a rational man who dealt in evidence, not mountain superstitions. The family had crossed here somehow, and he intended to determine how. The search expanded at dawn. Helicopters from the National Guard swept grid patterns over thousands of acres, while ground teams combed logging roads and abandoned mine shafts. The Kellerman case had attracted attention from Charleston to Washington, where FBI behavioral analysts studied the disappearance's unique characteristics. 7 people leaving no trace in wilderness terrain was statistically impossible. Yet the evidence, or lack thereof, spoke for itself. By Tuesday, searchers had covered 60 square miles without finding a single thread of clothing, footprint beyond the creek, or any sign the family had passed through the forest. It was as if they'd dissolved into morning mist, leaving only questions and the growing realization that conventional search methods had failed completely. The break came from an unexpected source. Clarence Marsh, a 74-year-old moonshiner who'd operated stills in these hills since Prohibition, approached Detective Cummins at the temporary command post, set up in Marlinton's fire station. Marsh had been avoiding law enforcement for 50 years, but the Kellerman disappearance had shaken him enough to risk exposure. "I seen them Sunday night," Marsh said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whole family walking up Devil's Ridge around midnight. But they wasn't alone." Cummins leaned forward. "What do you mean, not alone?" Marsh's weathered hands trembled as he described what he'd witnessed from his hidden, still sight. The Kellerman family moving in single file up a trail that ended at a sheer rock face, their white Sunday clothes visible in moonlight. But leading them, Marsh claimed, was a figure in dark clothing who seemed to glide rather than walk, leaving no footprints in the soft earth. "Mountain folk see many things. The thing is," Marsh continued, "that trail don't go nowhere. Been hunting these ridges since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and that path just stops at the cliff. Ain't no way down the other side, ain't no cave or nothing. But I watched them all disappear into the rock like it was made of smoke." Cummins studied the old man's face for signs of deception or delusion, but found only genuine fear. Marsh had risked decades of freedom to share this account, suggesting he believed every word. Whether his testimony represented truth or moonshine-addled imagination remained to be determined, but it provided the first potential lead in 3 days of fruitless searching. The detective gathered a small team for the trek to Devil's Ridge, a formation locals avoided even in daylight. The climb took 4 hours through terrain that grew increasingly hostile, thorns that shredded clothing, loose shale that shifted underfoot, and an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow sound. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind died to a whisper as they approached the ridge's summit. At the trail's end, they found exactly what Marsh had described: a dead end at a granite cliff face that rose 300 feet into gray sky. No cave openings, no hidden passages, no way for 7 people to have continued. Yet here the footprints ended, as if the family had simply walked into solid stone and vanished. Cummins ran his hands over the rock surface, searching for hidden switches or concealed openings that might explain the impossible. The granite felt normal, cold, rough, ancient, but offered no secrets. His team spread out, examining every inch of the cliff face and surrounding area. They found nothing. No rope marks, no climbing gear, no evidence that anyone had scaled the vertical wall. As afternoon shadows lengthened, a discovery changed everything. Carved into the cliff face, so faint it was nearly invisible, was a symbol that matched nothing in Detective Cummins's experience. A spiral within a circle, worn smooth by centuries of weather but still discernible to those who knew where to look. What did this marking mean, and who had carved it into rock that predated human civilization in these mountains? The symbol would lead investigators to archives in Charleston, where dusty records held accounts of similar disappearances dating back to the earliest European settlements, and the disturbing realization that the Kellermans were not the first family to vanish without trace in these particular hollows. The West Virginia State Archives smelled of dust and decay, its basement storage rooms holding secrets that officials preferred to keep buried beneath layers of bureaucratic neglect. Detective Cummins descended concrete steps that echoed like footfalls in a tomb, following archivist Helen Morrison through corridors lined with filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in decades. The symbol carved into Devil's Ridge had haunted him for 3 sleepless nights. Its spiral within circle design unlike anything in federal databases or occult reference materials, yet somehow familiar in a way that made his skin crawl. Helen, Sheriff Morrison's aunt and a 40-year veteran of the state archives, had agreed to help search historical records after Cummins described the marking. Her gnarled fingers traced through card catalogs that predated computer systems, stopping at entries marked with faded red stamps indicating unusual circumstances or investigation incomplete. "Here," she whispered, pulling a manila folder from a section labeled Pocahontas County Anomalies, 1850 to present. The file contained newspaper clippings, handwritten reports, and photographs that chronicled a pattern of disappearances spanning more than a century, all within a 5-mile radius of where the Kellermans had vanished. The earliest documented case dated to September 21, 1863, when the McCready family, Irish immigrants who'd settled near Spruce Creek, disappeared during a harvest celebration. Neighbors found their cabin abandoned mid-meal, with no signs of struggle or theft. The local newspaper, the Pocahontas Pioneer, reported that searchers discovered bare footprints leading into the forest, ending abruptly at the Devil's Stone, a granite formation local Cherokee had warned settlers to avoid. From the Pocahontas Pioneer, September 28, 1863. The McCready dwelling presents a scene most perplexing to Christian understanding. 7 souls vanished as if claimed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The pattern repeated with disturbing regularity. The Hoffman family in 1891. The Washingtons, freed slaves who'd built a farm near the creek in 1907. The Castellis in 1923. The Brennans in 1951. Each disappearance followed identical characteristics. Entire families, Sunday evening, no signs of violence, bare footprints leading to Devil's Ridge before vanishing completely. But it was the final entry that made Cummins's blood run cold. A photograph from 1951 showed the same spiral symbol carved into a tree near the Brennan homestead, accompanied by a report from State Police Detective William Hartley describing his investigation's failure to locate the missing family of 6. Hartley's notes, written in careful longhand, documented details that matched the Kellerman case with eerie precision. Subjects departed residence during evening meal. No evidence of coercion or struggle. Tracking attempts unsuccessful beyond Spruce Creek Crossing. Local populace exhibits reluctance to discuss case specifics. More disturbing was Hartley's final entry, dated 3 weeks after the Brennans vanished. Investigation suspended due to lack of evidence. Recommend case file be sealed pending development of new leads. Personal observation. Something in these mountains defies conventional explanation. Advise future investigators to approach with extreme caution. Helen Morrison's voice dropped to a whisper as she shared family stories passed down through generations of county residents. Her great-grandmother had been Cherokee, one of the few who'd remained in the mountains after the Trail of Tears, and had warned her descendants about the hungry place where spirits gathered to call the living home. "Grandmama used to say the mountain wanted company," Helen explained, her arthritic hands clutching the file folder. "Said it would sing to families on certain nights, make them walk into the darkness thinking they were going somewhere beautiful. But they never came back. Never." The weight of accumulated evidence pressed against Cummins's rational worldview like water against a failing dam. 7 families spanning 115 years, all disappearing under identical circumstances from the same geographical area. The statistical probability approached 0, yet the documented cases created an undeniable pattern that conventional investigation couldn't explain. Something lived in those mountains. Research into the symbol's origins led to Dr. Margaret Ashworth, an anthropologist at West Virginia University, who specialized in pre-Columbian American cultures. Her expertise in ancient petroglyphs and indigenous symbolism had earned recognition from the Smithsonian Institution, making her the state's leading authority on archaeological mysteries. Dr. Ashworth examined photographs of the cliff carving with intense concentration, comparing the spiral design to reference materials collected during 30 years of fieldwork. Her conclusion chilled Cummins more than the October mountain air. The symbol predated any known indigenous culture in the region, yet appeared in sites across North America where unexplained disappearances had occurred for centuries. "This marking is old," she said, her academic composure barely concealing deeper unease. "Older than Cherokee, older than any documented Native American presence in these mountains. It appears at sites in Colorado, Montana, Oregon, always in locations where people have vanished without explanation. The spiral represents a gateway or portal in numerous ancient belief systems. The circle suggests containment or capture." Ashworth's research revealed similar symbols at Mesa Verde, where entire ancestral Puebloan communities had abandoned their cliff dwellings in the 13th century, leaving behind only mysterious carvings and unanswered questions. Archaeological evidence suggested the inhabitants had departed suddenly, mid-activity, leaving meals uneaten and tools abandoned, exactly like the pattern observed in Pocahontas County. The anthropologist's voice grew troubled as she shared her most disturbing discovery. Identical symbols had been documented at sites worldwide where indigenous peoples had developed taboos against specific geographical locations, creating elaborate rituals to appease what they described as hungry spirits, or earth mouths, that consumed human offerings. Whatever created these markings, Ashworth concluded, has been active for millennia. Indigenous cultures worldwide developed similar warnings about places where people simply vanish. They understood something we've forgotten in our modern arrogance. As evening approached, Cummins drove back toward Pocahontas County with a growing sense that conventional police work had reached its limits. The evidence pointed toward something beyond normal criminal investigation, yet his duty remained unchanged. Find the Kellerman family or determine their fate through whatever means necessary. The mountain roads twisted through shadows that seemed deeper than natural darkness should allow, and twice he thought he glimpsed lights moving through the forest. Not the steady beam of flashlights, but a soft glow that danced between trees like foxfire or something more deliberate. What waited in those ancient hills that had claimed 7 families across more than a century? The answer would come from an unexpected source: Thomas Kellerman's military records, which revealed a tour of duty in Vietnam that had exposed him to classified operations involving phenomena the Pentagon preferred to deny existed. The Pentagon's fluorescent lights hummed like trapped insects as Detective Cummins waited in a sterile conference room that smelled of industrial coffee and government secrets. 3 days of bureaucratic warfare had finally secured him access to Thomas Kellerman's military service record, though the Army colonel who'd agreed to the meeting wore the expression of a man revealing state secrets under protest. What Cummins discovered in those classified files would shatter his understanding of what the Kellerman family had encountered in the West Virginia mountains, and why they might have been specifically targeted for disappearance. Colonel James Rutherford spread the documents across the metal table with reluctant precision. Thomas Kellerman's service record painted the picture of an exemplary soldier who'd earned his Purple Heart during conventional combat operations near Da Nang. But attached to his standard file was a classification stamp that made Cummins's stomach tighten. Eyes only. Project Blue Book adjacent. Sergeant Kellerman was selected for special assignment in November 1967, Rutherford explained, his voice carrying the weight of information he'd rather not share. Operation Looking Glass, joint CIA military investigation into unexplained phenomena affecting combat units in remote areas of South Vietnam. The photographs Rutherford revealed showed jungle clearings where entire Viet Cong camps had been found abandoned, without signs of battle or withdrawal. Equipment remained in place, meals half-eaten, weapons unclaimed. American reconnaissance teams reported identical discoveries across a 100-mile radius of dense forest where local villagers refused to venture, describing the area as cursed by spirits that called people into the green darkness. Thomas Kellerman had been part of a 12-man team tasked with investigating these anomalous sites. His job: document evidence and interview surviving witnesses who'd escaped the affected areas. What he'd learned during 6 months of classified operations was contained in reports that officially didn't exist. From Kellerman's field notes, dated March 14, 1968. Site 7 exhibits all previous characteristics. 43 personnel vanished simultaneously. No evidence of hostile action. Local interpreter describes singing stones that call to humans during certain lunar phases. Symbol carved into tree trunk matches markings found at sites 2, 4, and 9. Rutherford slid a photograph across the table that made Cummins's hands tremble. Carved into a Vietnamese teak tree was the same spiral within circle symbol he'd found on Devil's Ridge. The marking was fresh in the 1968 photograph, its lines sharp and deliberate against the tropical bark. Kellerman's team documented 17 sites exhibiting identical phenomena, the colonel continued. Mass disappearances, unexplained symbols, local populations with generational taboos against specific geographical areas. The pattern suggested something beyond conventional understanding. The operation had ended abruptly when Kellerman's team encountered the phenomenon directly. According to heavily redacted reports, 8 of the 12 investigators had vanished during a night reconnaissance mission, leaving behind only their equipment and bare footprints that ended at a limestone cliff face. Thomas Kellerman was among the 4 survivors who'd been found 3 days later, suffering from severe psychological trauma and partial memory loss. Military psychiatrists had diagnosed him with combat stress reaction, but his confidential medical files revealed symptoms that didn't match conventional PTSD. Recurring nightmares about hungry mountains, episodes of sleepwalking toward forested areas, and an obsessive fear of spiral symbols that triggered panic attacks lasting hours. Something had touched his mind. After his discharge, Kellerman was monitored by military intelligence, Rutherford admitted. Standard procedure for personnel exposed to classified phenomena. The surveillance reports indicate he'd adapted well to civilian life until approximately 2 weeks before his family disappeared. The final surveillance entry, dated October 1, 1978, documented Thomas Kellerman's increasingly erratic behavior. Talking to himself in Vietnamese phrases he'd never spoken before, carving spiral symbols into trees around the family property, and walking barefoot into the forest during early morning hours before returning with no memory of his excursions. Most disturbing was the psychiatrist's final assessment. Subject appears to be responding to external stimuli of unknown origin. Recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation and possible relocation away from current geographical area. The recommendation had arrived one day too late. Cummins studied the classified documents with growing horror, recognizing the pattern that connected Vietnam to West Virginia. Whatever force had been claiming people in the Appalachian Mountains had also been active in Southeast Asian jungles, marking its presence with identical symbols and following the same operational methodology. But why had it specifically called Thomas Kellerman home? The answer lay in additional classified research that Rutherford reluctantly shared. Project Looking Glass had theorized that certain individuals possessed heightened sensitivity to what researchers termed anomalous geographical phenomena, locations where normal physical laws seemed temporarily suspended. These sensitives could be influenced across vast distances, drawn back to sites where the phenomenon was strongest. Kellerman had tested positive for this sensitivity, Rutherford explained. His exposure in Vietnam may have created a permanent connection to whatever force operates in these areas. We've documented similar cases worldwide. Individuals who encounter the phenomenon once become perpetual targets for future contact. The classification extended beyond Thomas to his entire family. Military analysts had identified genetic components to the sensitivity, suggesting that children of affected individuals carried inherited vulnerability to the phenomenon's influence. Amy and Sarah Kellerman had been flagged for monitoring since birth, their potential sensitivity making them high-value targets for whatever intelligence was behind the disappearances. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the military psychiatrist who'd treated Thomas after Vietnam, provided the final piece of the puzzle. Her research into anomalous phenomena had revealed a disturbing truth. The entities or forces responsible for mass disappearances weren't random in their selection. They specifically sought individuals who could serve as bridges between human consciousness and something far older and more alien than conventional understanding could accept. Thomas wasn't just a victim, Dr. Chen explained during a secure phone call. He was a recruitment tool. Whatever claimed his team in Vietnam had been preparing him for 10 years, conditioning his mind to accept its influence and eventually lead his family to a predetermined location. The implications staggered Cummins. The Kellerman disappearance wasn't a random tragedy, but the culmination of a decade-long process that had begun in Vietnamese jungles and ended on a West Virginia mountain. Thomas had been programmed, his family selected, their fate sealed the moment he'd encountered those carved symbols in a foreign war. But if the military had been monitoring the family, why hadn't they intervened? The answer would emerge from the darkest corners of government secrecy. Project Looking Glass hadn't been designed to prevent these disappearances, but to study them, using American families as unwitting research subjects in an investigation into phenomena that threatened national security on a scale beyond public comprehension. The classified briefing room in Langley smelled of stale cigarettes and paranoia, its windowless walls lined with maps marking anomalous disappearance sites across 6 continents. Dr. Harrison Webb, the CIA's chief analyst for unexplained phenomena, chain-smoked Marlboros, while explaining to Detective Cummins how the United States government had been tracking entities like the one in West Virginia since 1947. Project Looking Glass was just one tentacle of a vast intelligence operation designed not to protect American citizens, but to weaponize whatever forces were systematically harvesting human beings from remote locations worldwide. Webb spread aerial photographs across the metal table, each image showing geographical features that shared disturbing similarities with Devil's Ridge. Isolated rock formations in Colorado, limestone cliffs in Montana, granite outcroppings in Oregon, all marked with the same spiral symbols, all sites where families had vanished without trace over decades of careful documentation. "We've been monitoring these locations since Roswell," Webb explained, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd spent 30 years studying horrors that officially didn't exist. "Initially, we thought we were dealing with extraterrestrial contact. Took us 20 years to realize we were facing something far older and more terrestrial than little green men." The photographs revealed a network of sites that formed geometric patterns across the North American continent, connected by underground geological features that geologists couldn't explain. Magnetic anomalies, gravitational disturbances, areas where compasses spun wildly and electronic equipment failed without cause. The government had been secretly purchasing land around these locations, establishing restricted zones under various cover stories, while conducting research that violated every ethical standard of human experimentation. From a classified memorandum dated June 12, 1975, Project Looking Glass Phase 3 authorized test subjects to be selected from military personnel with demonstrated sensitivity to anomalous phenomena. Family units preferred for comprehensive data collection. Thomas Kellerman hadn't been randomly assigned to Operation Looking Glass in Vietnam. He'd been specifically recruited after psychological testing revealed his elevated sensitivity to what researchers termed non-human intelligence manifestations. His exposure to the phenomenon in Southeast Asia had been deliberate, designed to create a permanent psychic connection that could be monitored and eventually exploited. Webb's revelation struck Cummins like a physical blow. The Kellerman family hadn't been victims of an unexplained disappearance, but unwitting test subjects in a government experiment that treated American citizens as expendable resources in the pursuit of strategic advantage over hostile forces that predated human civilization. "The entities we're dealing with aren't invaders," Webb continued, stubbing out his cigarette with trembling fingers. "They're indigenous to this planet, possibly its original inhabitants. They've been selectively harvesting humans for millennia, but we've only recently begun to understand their selection criteria and operational methodology." The intelligence community's research had revealed that the forces behind the disappearances weren't randomly choosing victims. They specifically targeted individuals with genetic markers indicating psychic sensitivity, particularly those who'd been exposed to traumatic stress that enhanced their receptivity to non-human mental influence. Veterans, abuse survivors, people who'd experienced profound loss, all demonstrated increased vulnerability to what researchers classified as anomalous psychological manipulation. But the government's interest wasn't humanitarian. Dr. Chen's psychiatric research had been funded, by military intelligence seeking to develop human entity communication protocols that could provide strategic advantages in conflicts where conventional weapons proved ineffective. The disappearances were being studied not to prevent them, but to replicate their methodology for intelligence and military applications. Webb pulled out a file marked with classifications that made Cummins's security clearance seem irrelevant. Inside were photographs of military personnel who'd been deliberately exposed to anomalous sites under controlled conditions, their subsequent psychological deterioration documented with clinical precision. Some had been found days later in remote locations, babbling about hungry mountains and spiral singers. Others had simply vanished, their disappearances written off as combat casualties or training accidents. The most disturbing revelation concerned Operation Pied Piper, a classified program that had been using identified sensitives as unknowing bait to attract and study the entities responsible for mass disappearances. Thomas Kellerman's return to West Virginia hadn't been coincidental. He'd been guided there by psychological conditioning designed to activate during specific triggering events. "We've been feeding people to these things for decades," Webb admitted, his professional composure cracking under the weight of accumulated guilt. "Telling ourselves it was necessary research for national security. But the truth is, we've been collaborating with forces that view humanity as a renewable resource. Knowledge eats at the soul." The collaboration extended beyond passive observation. Government researchers had developed communication protocols with the entities, exchanging information about human psychology and social organization in return for limited insight into the phenomenon's origins and capabilities. The spiral symbols weren't just markers. They were part of a sophisticated communication system that allowed coordination between human collaborators and non-human intelligences. Dr. Webb showed Cummins surveillance footage from hidden cameras positioned around various anomalous sites. The grainy black and white images captured figures in government vehicles arriving at remote locations during new moon phases, carrying what appeared to be offerings or sacrificial materials. The footage was too poor to identify specific individuals, but the institutional nature of the collaboration was undeniable. "Project Looking Glass was supposed to give us leverage," Webb explained. "Understanding these entities enough to negotiate terms or develop defensive measures. Instead, we became junior partners in an operation that's been harvesting human consciousness for purposes we still don't comprehend." The worst revelation came last. The Kellerman family hadn't been the only recent test subjects. Webb revealed files documenting 17 similar cases over the past 5 years, all involving military families with demonstrated psychic sensitivity, all guided to anomalous sites through carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation. The disappearances had been scheduled, monitored, and documented by government observers who watched entire families vanish while recording data for analysis. Cummins felt physically sick as he realized the implications. The investigation he'd been conducting wasn't solving a mystery, but uncovering evidence of systematic human trafficking conducted by his own government in partnership with entities that viewed humanity as livestock. The badges and authority he'd trusted his entire career had been tools in an operation that sacrificed American families for intelligence purposes that remained classified beyond his security level. "Why are you telling me this?" Cummins asked, his voice barely steady. Webb's answer chilled him more than the October mountain air. "Because Phase 4 is about to begin. The entities have been studying human social organization through our collaboration. They understand our government structures, our military capabilities, our psychological vulnerabilities. The selective harvesting was just preparation for something larger." The files Webb showed him next contained intelligence estimates that made the Kellerman disappearance seem insignificant compared to what was coming. Satellite imagery of anomalous sites showed increased activity patterns. Electromagnetic readings indicated massive energy buildups. Communication intercepts suggested coordination between entities across multiple continents. Whatever had been selectively taking individuals and families was preparing for a harvest on a scale that would make previous disappearances look like reconnaissance missions. But buried in the classified research was one piece of hope. The location where taken individuals were being held wasn't in another dimension or alien realm, but in vast underground complexes beneath the anomalous sites themselves. The Kellerman family might still be alive, along with hundreds of other victims stretching back decades. The question was whether anyone would risk everything to attempt a rescue operation that would expose the government's darkest collaboration and potentially trigger retaliation from forces beyond human understanding. The mineshaft elevator descended into absolute darkness, its ancient cables groaning like dying animals as Detective Cummins and Dr. Webb dropped 300 feet beneath the West Virginia mountains. The air grew thick with the smell of wet stone and something else, a sweet, organic odor that made Cummins's throat constrict with primal revulsion. Their illegal descent into the abandoned Seneca mine, guided by Webb's classified geological surveys, would reveal where the disappeared families had been taken and what had been done to them in the decades since their capture. Webb's flashlight beam carved through darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, illuminating tunnel walls that showed tool marks unlike anything used in conventional mining operations. The cuts were too precise, too geometrically perfect, suggesting machinery that operated on principles beyond current human technology. Along the carved surfaces, spiral symbols appeared at regular intervals, glowing faintly with bioluminescent residue that pulsed in rhythm with something deeper in the mountain's heart. The geological surveys were falsified, Webb explained, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. This mine was never used for coal extraction. It was a natural cave system that we've been secretly expanding for 30 years, following blueprints provided by our non-human partners. The elevator stopped with a metallic shriek that reverberated through tunnels extending beyond their light's reach. They stepped onto a platform carved from living rock, where the geometric precision of the construction became immediately apparent. The passages branched in mathematical patterns that hurt to contemplate directly, following angles that seemed to fold space back on itself in ways that made navigation impossible without guidance. Webb consulted a hand-drawn map that showed route markings and symbols that matched the cliff carvings. The complex extends for miles in every direction, he said. Multiple levels, different sections serving specific functions. What we're looking for is in Section C, the preservation areas. They walked for 20 minutes through corridors that defied conventional architecture, passing chambers filled with equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. Some devices resembled medical monitoring systems, banks of screens displaying wavelengths and frequencies that tracked biological functions. Others looked like communication arrays. Dishes and antennae pointed toward receivers built into the mountain's geological structure. The first preserved human they encountered stopped Cummins's heart. Margaret Hoffman sat in a crystalline alcove, her body perfectly maintained despite disappearing in 1891. Her eyes were open but vacant, staring at something beyond physical perception. Tubes connected to her spine fed a clear fluid that kept her tissue alive while extracting something else. Memories, consciousness, the essential patterns that made her human. Row after row of similar alcoves stretched into the tunnel's depths, each containing a preserved individual from the documented disappearances. The McCready family from 1863, the Washingtons from 1907, dozens of others spanning more than a century of selective harvesting. Their minds connected to a vast network that pulsed with collective consciousness. They're still alive down here. Webb's explanation came in clinical terms that couldn't mask the horror of what they witnessed. The entities don't kill their subjects. They preserve them indefinitely while harvesting neural patterns, memories, skills, emotional responses. It's a form of consciousness mining that provides them with detailed intelligence about human society and psychology. The preservation process was sophisticated beyond current medical understanding. The subjects' bodies were maintained in perfect stasis while their minds were slowly extracted, uploaded to a collective database that allowed the entities to study human behavior patterns across multiple generations. The process took decades to complete, meaning every person taken was still technically alive, experiencing a form of existence that couldn't be called living. In Section D, they found the Kellerman family. Harold Kellerman sat in the central alcove, his weathered face peaceful despite the tubes connected to his brainstem. Around him, the rest of the family remained in identical preservation chambers: Thomas and Susan, the twin daughters, young Michael. They showed no signs of physical deterioration, but their eyes held the same vacant stare that indicated conscious awareness, trapped in motionless bodies. Cummins approached Amy Kellerman's alcove with trembling hands, studying the 8-year-old girl who should have been in school instead of serving as a research subject for non-human intelligence. Her small chest rose and fell with artificial respiration, while machines monitored brain activity that spiked whenever Cummins moved within her field of vision. She could see him. She was aware. The preservation chambers were connected to a central processing unit that Webb identified as the core of the operation. Massive organic computers grew from the mountain's geological structure, their biomechanical components pulsing with the accumulated consciousness of hundreds of harvested humans. The entity intelligence wasn't separate from its human subjects, but incorporated their mental patterns into a hybrid awareness that understood humanity from the inside out. This is how they've been learning, Webb explained. Not through observation, but through direct neural interface with human consciousness. They understand our fears, our desires, our social structures, because they've been absorbing human minds for centuries. The implications staggered Cummins as he realized the scope of the intelligence operation. Every person taken had contributed their lifetime of memories and experiences to an alien database that mapped human civilization with unprecedented accuracy. The entities knew more about human psychology than humans themselves, having studied it from the perspective of hundreds of absorbed personalities. But the preservation chambers served another purpose beyond intelligence gathering. Webb led him to Section E, where rows of empty alcoves waited with fresh preservation equipment and monitoring systems. The facility was expanding, preparing for a massive increase in subjects that suggested the selective harvesting phase was ending. Phase 4, Webb said grimly. Mass collection events targeting entire population centers. The research phase is complete. They understand us well enough to begin large-scale operations. Computer terminals throughout the facility displayed tactical information that made Cummins's blood freeze. Population density maps of major cities, infrastructure vulnerability assessments, psychological profiles of government officials and military leaders. The entities weren't planning random abductions, but coordinated operations designed to cripple human resistance before beginning systematic harvesting of the entire population. The government's collaboration had provided them with everything needed to replace selective disappearances with species-wide collection. Human officials had unknowingly created the intelligence framework for their own civilization's destruction, trading individual families for information that would ultimately be used to enslave everyone. In the facility's deepest section, they found the entities themselves. The beings weren't alien visitors, but Earth's original inhabitants, ancient intelligences that had been dormant beneath the planet's surface for millions of years, awakening only when human civilization developed enough to become useful. They resembled massive neural networks more than individual creatures, their consciousness distributed through biological computers that interfaced directly with the mountain's geological structure. Communication with them was automatic and involuntary. Standing in their presence triggered immediate mental contact that flooded Cummins's awareness with information he couldn't process or reject. The entities had been patient gardeners, allowing human civilization to develop while subtly guiding its evolution toward forms that would be most useful for their purposes. The spiral symbols weren't just markers, but transmission devices that allowed mental influence across vast distances. Every person who'd seen the carvings had been tagged for future collection, their neural patterns mapped and monitored until the optimal moment for harvesting arrived. But in the overwhelming flood of alien consciousness, Cummins glimpsed something unexpected: uncertainty about their next phase. The entities had studied human psychology extensively, but remained puzzled by certain behavioral patterns that suggested resistance capabilities they couldn't fully predict or control. The human capacity for sacrifice, for protecting others at personal cost, for fighting against impossible odds, these traits didn't compute within their utilitarian worldview. They'd been studying individual minds, but had never encountered collective human resistance on the scale they were about to face. That uncertainty represented the only hope for preventing Phase 4 from succeeding, but exploiting it would require exposing the collaboration and convincing a skeptical world that the threat was real before mass collection events began in population centers worldwide. The emergency broadcast interrupted every television and radio signal across West Virginia at 11:47 p.m. on October 29, 1978, carrying Detective Cummins's voice into living rooms where families sat unaware that their government had been trading their lives for intelligence cooperation with Earth's original predators. His unauthorized transmission, broadcast from a hijacked emergency system, would either save millions of people or trigger the premature activation of Phase 4, a mass collection event that would reduce human civilization to livestock in underground preservation facilities. This is Detective Marcus Cummins of the Pocahontas County Sheriff's Department. His voice crackled through static that couldn't quite mask the desperation behind each word. I'm speaking from beneath the mountains where your missing families are being held alive in conditions that violate every principle of human dignity. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but your survival depends on believing it. The broadcast had been Dr. Webb's idea, a final gambit by a man whose conscience could no longer bear the weight of decades-long collaboration with entities that viewed humanity as a renewable resource. Together, they'd escaped the underground facility with video evidence and classified documents that proved the government's complicity in systematic human trafficking on a scale beyond historical precedent. Webb sat beside Cummins in the makeshift broadcast station they'd established in an abandoned fire tower, feeding technical details through earphones while monitoring emergency frequencies for the military response that would inevitably come. They had perhaps 20 minutes before federal agents located their transmission source and terminated the broadcast with extreme prejudice. The Kellerman family didn't disappear, Cummins continued. his words carrying across airwaves to an audience that included government officials scrambling to cut the transmission. They were delivered to non-human entities operating beneath our mountains through a collaboration between intelligence agencies and forces that have been harvesting humans for over a century. Emergency services across 3 states erupted into chaos as Cummins described the underground preservation facilities, the neural harvesting operations, and the government's role in providing test subjects for intelligence purposes. Switchboards jammed with calls from citizens demanding explanations, while military commanders issued orders to locate and silence the unauthorized broadcast. The response came faster than anticipated. Helicopters appeared over the mountains within 15 minutes, their searchlights sweeping through darkness toward the fire tower, where Cummins and Webb had established their desperate last stand. Military vehicles converged on access roads while communications jamming equipment worked to override their broadcast signal. But the 20 minutes had been enough. The emergency transmission had reached listeners across the eastern seaboard, recorded by amateur radio operators and television stations that rebroadcast the content before federal orders could stop them. The revelations spread through underground networks and international media outlets that operated beyond direct government control. In the underground facility, the entities detected the exposure through monitoring systems that tracked human communications worldwide. The revelation triggered immediate defensive protocols as their carefully maintained secrecy collapsed in real time. Phase 4 activation became necessary, not for strategic advantage but for species survival, their own. The collection events began at dawn. Across 17 states, the spiral symbols carved into geological formations began emitting electromagnetic pulses that activated dormant neural conditioning in thousands of individuals who'd been unknowingly tagged for harvest over the previous decades. Veterans who'd served in classified operations, family members of disappeared persons, anyone who'd encountered the symbols directly during previous investigations. Mass sleepwalking events drew people from their homes toward anomalous sites where processing facilities had been secretly prepared for decades. Unlike the selective disappearances that had claimed individual families, Phase 4 involved coordinated collection of entire communities, guided by psychological conditioning that made resistance nearly impossible for affected individuals. Dr. Chen's research proved accurate as military families demonstrated the highest vulnerability to the neural activation signals. Thousands of service members and their dependents abandoned their posts and homes, walking barefoot toward collection points, while their unaffected neighbors watched in horror. The conditioning that had made them valuable intelligence assets also made them priority targets for immediate harvesting. Military forces trapped them within. But Cummins's broadcast had created an unexpected variable in the entity's calculations. The exposure of government collaboration triggered widespread civil unrest as citizens realized their own officials had been facilitating the disappearances. Trust in authority collapsed as evidence emerged of decades-long complicity in operations that sacrificed American families for intelligence purposes. The entities had studied individual human psychology extensively, but underestimated the collective response to betrayal on such a massive scale. Their human collaborators found themselves isolated and powerless as military units refused orders and government officials faced popular uprisings that made coordination impossible. From Emergency Communications, October 30th, 1978. Washington Command to all units. Government continuity protocols in effect. Civilian uprising threatening operational security. Recommend immediate implementation of martial law. The response was fragmented and ineffective. Military commanders, who'd been kept ignorant of the collaboration, refused to suppress uprisings they couldn't understand, while those who knew the truth found their authority compromised by their complicity in crimes against humanity. The careful balance of power that had enabled the entity's operations for decades collapsed in a single day. In the chaos, rescue operations began forming spontaneously as families of the disappeared organized to assault the collection facilities. Armed with Cummins's broadcast information and driven by desperate hope, these civilian forces proved more effective than military units hampered by conflicting orders and moral paralysis. The assault on the Seneca mine facility came at noon on October 31st, led by relatives of the Kellerman family and other disappeared persons who'd been given up for dead. The attackers included Harold Kellerman's brother James, a Vietnam veteran who'd spent 10 years believing his family had died in an accident, and Susan Kellerman's sister, Patricia, who'd never accepted the official explanation for the disappearance. What they found in the underground chambers validated their worst fears and their desperate hopes simultaneously. The preservation facilities contained hundreds of victims spanning more than a century, all maintained in suspended animation while their consciousness was slowly extracted for alien intelligence purposes. But the neural harvesting process had been incomplete for most subjects. The human capacity for mental resistance had proved stronger than the entity's initial calculations, leaving partial consciousness intact in many preservation chambers. The rescued individuals emerged confused and traumatized, but fundamentally human, their personalities and memories largely intact, despite years or decades of captivity. The Kellerman family reunion occurred in a medical tent erected outside the mine entrance, where military medics worked frantically to disconnect preservation equipment and stabilize the rescued victims. Harold Kellerman's first words upon awakening were a question about Sunday dinner, his mind still processing the interruption that had occurred weeks ago in his subjective experience. But the rescue operation had triggered defensive responses throughout the entity network. As preservation facilities were compromised across multiple states, the ancient intelligences beneath the mountains began implementing protocols designed to prevent their exposure to surface-dwelling humanity. The underground complexes started collapsing in controlled sequences that would bury evidence of their existence beneath tons of geological rubble. The entities themselves began withdrawing deeper into the Earth's crust, following ancient migration routes that led to dormancy chambers where they could wait for human civilization to forget the threat they represented. Their collaboration with surface governments had been exposed and terminated, but their fundamental presence remained intact for future reactivation when conditions became favorable again. As November brought the first mountain snows to West Virginia, the immediate crisis had passed, but the larger implications remained unresolved. The government's credibility had been permanently damaged by revelations of collaboration with hostile non-human intelligence, while the rescued victims faced psychological challenges that no medical protocol could adequately address. But most disturbing was the realization that the exposed facilities represented only a fraction of the entity's global operations. Intelligence gathered during the rescue missions indicated similar complexes beneath every continent, all connected through geological networks that predated human civilization by millions of years. The Kellerman family had returned from the edge of an abyss that still yawed beneath humanity's feet, waiting for the next opportunity to resume operations that would reduce the entire species to preserved consciousness in underground chambers. The immediate battle had been won, but the war for human survival had only just begun. What would happen when the entities emerged from their dormancy to find a world that remembered their threat and had prepared for their return? The congressional hearing room fell silent as Senator Patricia McKenzie read from classified documents that would never appear in official transcripts. her voice carrying the weight of revelations that had shattered public trust in government institutions across the globe. 3 years after Detective Cummins's emergency broadcast exposed the collaboration between human authorities and ancient terrestrial entities, the full scope of the betrayal continued unfolding like a malignant flower blooming in darkness. The rescued victims had told their stories to investigators who struggled to process testimony that challenged every assumption about humanity's place in the natural order, but their physical evidence proved impossible to dismiss or explain away through conventional means. Senator Mackenzie held up a photograph taken during the Seneca Mine rescue operation, showing Harold Kellerman connected to biomechanical preservation equipment that incorporated technology beyond current human understanding. This image was captured on November 1st, 1978, she stated. The subject had been maintained in suspended animation for 17 days, while neural extraction procedures were performed by non-human intelligences operating beneath American territory. The Senate Intelligence Committee had spent 3 years investigating the scope of government collaboration with what researchers now termed indigenous terrestrial intelligence. Ancient entities that had been manipulating human development from underground complexes connected by geological networks spanning every continent. The evidence painted a picture of systematic infiltration that extended far beyond the documented disappearances in West Virginia. Dr. Webb, granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, revealed the full extent of Operation Looking Glass and its successor programs. "We weren't investigating these entities," he admitted to the packed hearing room. "We were being recruited by them. Every piece of intelligence we gathered was shared with non-human controllers who used our own research to develop more effective harvesting methodologies. The collaboration had begun in 1947, not with extraterrestrial contact, but with the discovery of ancient preservation facilities beneath Nevada's nuclear testing sites. Military engineers had initially assumed they'd found evidence of a previous civilization, but communication attempts had revealed active intelligence that offered technological exchange in return for access to human subjects for research purposes. What followed was a 50-year partnership that treated American citizens as expendable resources in an intelligence operation designed to map human consciousness for purposes that remained classified beyond congressional oversight. The selective disappearances had been test runs for mass collection events that would reduce global population to manageable levels while preserving essential personnel in underground facilities. Memory is humanity's weapon now. The rescued victims faced challenges that no medical protocol could adequately address. Years or decades of neural extraction had left them with fragmented memories and psychological trauma that defied conventional treatment. Some remembered experiencing their captivity as extended dreams filled with alien perspectives that had been integrated into their consciousness during the harvesting process. Harold Kellerman's testimony provided the most disturbing insights into the preservation experience. "Time moved differently down there," he explained to the committee. "I lived through their memories while they studied mine. Saw the world through eyes that remembered when humans were just another animal species competing for resources. They've been watching us develop for thousands of years, waiting for us to become useful." The entity's perspective, filtered through Harold's fragmented recollections, revealed the harvesting operation's true purpose. Human consciousness wasn't being extracted for study, but for integration into a collective intelligence that combined ancient terrestrial knowledge with human innovation and creativity. The preserved victims were components in a hybrid awareness that planned to resume surface operations once global attention shifted to other concerns. Dr. Margaret Ashworth's anthropological research had documented similar collaborations throughout human history. Ancient civilizations that had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only cryptic warnings about hungry earth and spiral singers. The pattern suggested periodic activation cycles where the entities emerged to harvest technological and cultural developments before returning to dormancy while human civilization rebuilt itself. "We're not the first technological society they've infiltrated," Ashworth testified. "Archaeological evidence suggests this cycle has repeated multiple times over the past 10,000 years. They allow human civilization to develop to a certain threshold, then harvest the accumulated knowledge and reduce population to sustainable levels before beginning the process again." The immediate crisis had passed, but evidence indicated the entities remained active in underground complexes that extended beneath every major population center. Seismic monitoring detected ongoing construction activity at depths that made conventional intervention impossible, while electromagnetic anomalies suggested communication networks that connected preservation facilities worldwide. International cooperation had developed protocols for detecting and preventing future collaboration. But the entity's extended lifespan and patience made them formidable adversaries in any long-term conflict. They could afford to wait decades or centuries for human vigilance to relax, while their understanding of human psychology provided advantages that conventional military planning couldn't overcome. The Kellerman family had rebuilt their lives on the surface, but their ordeal had left permanent changes that served as constant reminders of the threat that lurked beneath human civilization. Thomas Kellerman's sensitivity to electromagnetic fields allowed him to detect entity activity before electronic monitoring systems registered anomalies, making him an invaluable early warning asset for government agencies that had earned his reluctant cooperation. Amy and Sarah Kellerman, now 11 years old, displayed enhanced pattern recognition abilities that researchers attributed to their exposure to alien intelligence during their preservation. They could identify spiral symbols in photographs and architectural features that adult observers missed, suggesting their neural development had been permanently altered by the harvesting process. The twins' abilities proved crucial when new symbols began appearing in urban environments during 1981, carved into subway tunnels and building foundations with the same geometric precision that characterized the mountain facilities. The entities were preparing for renewed surface operations, establishing communication networks beneath major cities, while human authorities struggled to develop effective countermeasures. But human adaptation had surprised the ancient intelligences. The exposure of their operations had triggered evolutionary responses they hadn't anticipated, as survivors of the preservation process developed enhanced resistance to neural manipulation and improved detection of entity presence. The harvesting had created its own antibodies within human consciousness. Detective Cummins, now heading a federal task force dedicated to monitoring entity activity, received reports of increasing underground construction activity beneath Washington, D.C., New York, and Los Angeles. The scale suggested preparation for collection events that would dwarf the selective disappearances of previous decades. But the entities had learned caution from their exposure in West Virginia. The next phase would be more subtle, more patient, designed to avoid the public revelation that had compromised their previous operations. But human awareness of the threat had created new variables in their calculations, resistance capabilities that couldn't be easily overcome through traditional infiltration methods. As autumn returned to the West Virginia mountains in 1981, local residents reported strange lights moving through the forests near Devil's Ridge, accompanied by sounds that resembled singing but carried harmonics that made listeners feel compelled to investigate their source. The entities were testing new approaches, refining their methodology based on lessons learned from their previous exposure. The spiral symbols were evolving, becoming more complex and harder to detect, while maintaining their psychological influence over sensitive individuals. New disappearances began occurring in remote areas, single individuals rather than entire families, suggesting a return to experimental harvesting while larger operations remained in preparation stages. But the mountains still hold their secrets, and in certain hollows where the mist gathers thick on moonless nights, hikers report hearing voices calling from the darkness, voices that sound like family members who vanished years ago, inviting the living to join them in places where time moves differently and the earth itself hunger for company. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.